Hello. Welcome to North Country History with Rob Berg. On today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about the white pine, Michigan's green gold. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. The white pine is the tree that really made Michigan. It's the tree that was the focus by the lumbermen. It is our state tree in Michigan. It is really what kind of says up north when one travels to the northern part of the state, be it the northern lower peninsula or the upper peninsula. So in this episode, I'm going to introduce you to the white pine and why it's been important, not just in Michigan, but throughout the United States, or at least the eastern United States. Stay tuned with me as we talk about the eastern white pine, Michigan's green gold. Imagine that you're a new immigrant to British North America in the 1600s. As your ship approaches the New England coast, you notice the towering pines along the shore. You're coming from a land where most of the forests have long disappeared, so you're amazed by both the size and the number of these trees. Forests as far as the eye can see, of trees reaching 100, 150, and even 200 feet into the sky. These trees are of the species known as Pinus Strobus, but we know it better as the eastern white pine. This tree, one of the largest trees found in the eastern half of North America, would become one of the most valued resources in the young colonies and later dominating the economy of the United States in the 19th century. The white pine quickly became important to the new English settlements along the Atlantic coast and to the British monarchy. The large white pines, growing more than 150 feet tall with trunks as large as 4 to 6 foot in diameter, was one of the best sources of lumber for building construction. Houses, barns, and entire towns were built of this pine. The British Navy also recognized the value of these trees for shipbuilding. By this time, the Royal Navy had ascended to being the greatest power on the seas, and to maintain that dominance over the Dutch, French, and Spanish, they had to continue to build the best warships on Earth. Strong masts and spars were needed to carry the sails that powered these ships. The strongest masts were those built of a single length of lumber, which came from the tall pines of North America. Those built from the pines and firs of the Baltic Sea had to cobble together 2 or more lengths of tree trunk to match the needed height of a mast. These would be weaker and more susceptible to damage in storms and battles. And because of the value of the white pine to the Royal Navy, beginning in the 1690s, all pines with a trunk diameter of 24 inches or more were marked with the broad arrow. This mark, made with the 3 strokes of an axe into the bark of the tree, identified that the tree was the king's property and reserved for the use of the Royal Navy. Colonists who were caught cutting down the king's trees could face fines or jail. Regardless of this, many continued to cut the large pines down and milled them into building materials. In the 1760s, John Wentworth was appointed as the royal governor of New Hampshire. Under Wentworth's leadership, the colony began enforcing the mast laws that protected the pines for naval use. Surveyors were sent into the forest and surrounding communities to seek out those who had cut the trees. In 1772, sawmills in Ware, Goffstown, and Bedford, New Hampshire, were found to contain tree trunks marked with the broad arrow. Suits were brought against the mill owners. While the mill owners in Bedford and Goffstown were willing to pay fines, those in Ware refused. On April 13th, Sheriff Benjamin Whiting and his deputy, John Quigley, rode to Ware and arrested mill owner Ebenezer Mudgett. Mudgett was released on bond with the promise that he would pay bail the next morning. Whiting and Quigley took rooms at Aaron Quimby's Inn for the night. Before dawn the next day, however, Whiting and Quigley were attacked in their rooms by a mob and assaulted with switches. Naked and bloodied men were tied to their horses and driven out of town. Days later, Sheriff Whiting, with the assistance of militia officers and a posse, returned to Ware and arrested suspected members of the mob that had assaulted him and Deputy Quigley. The men were convicted and fined by a sympathetic court. This incident became known as the Pine Tree Riot and is considered as an inspiration for the Boston Tea Party in 1773. With the conclusion of the War of Independence, the white pine lumber industry became one of the new nation's earliest industries. For miles, we drove in and out along a narrow road with the trees so close that it required the strictest attention of our salesman Jehu to carry us through without collision. As far as I could see across the snow that lay smooth and unwrinkled like a spotless counterpane, rose the fair, round columns of pine. Throwing back the head, one saw the branches reaching out to one another far overhead, interlacing and crowding to form a dark green canopy, through which there fell occasional glimpses of a sky that seemed to rest upon the trees. Charles Ellis, Among the Michigan Pines, The Current, Chicago, 1885, Volume 3. The United States was a fast-growing country in the 19th century. In the 85 years from independence to the start of the Civil War, the U.S. expanded from the original 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast to stretching all the way across the continent. The eastern white pine, the tree that was much coveted by the lumbermen, covered much of eastern North America, having a range from the Atlantic Ocean west to the Great Lakes and beyond to the prairies at the edge of the Great Plains. In Canada, the pine could be found in the Canadian maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, in Quebec, Ontario, and to the eastern edge of Manitoba. Below the border in the United States, the white pine grew in the New England states, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and along the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains south to the Carolinas and Georgia. This vast range of the white pine made it valuable as a local commodity, but also its size and characteristics made it popular as well. The white pine is one of the largest trees that is found in eastern North America. Today, the largest white pines that one may encounter rise to a height of about 150 to 160 feet high, with a trunk diameter of 4 feet. Historically, though, the white pine could grow up to 210 feet tall and trunks as wide as 6 feet, though there were even a few examples of 7 and 8 foot diameter tree trunks. Along with the tall and wide trunks, white pines growing together in a forest had few branches along the lower trunk. This lack of branches meant that the lumber produced from the tree would have few knots that could affect the strength of the wood. White pine is also lightweight compared to hardwoods like elm, maple, and oak. This made it easier to build with, and because the main routes of transportation in the pre-industrial age were rivers, it floated very well. Until the 1870s, the prime time for logging was winter. Because of the size and weight of the pine logs, the best way for moving the logs from the forest to the mills was by water. Floating logs down rivers was best done in the spring on the high water of the spring melt. To get the logs to the rivers, logs were moved by oxen or horse-drawn sleds in the winter. Roads were iced to make it easier. Because of the limitations of animal power, the trees were cut no further than a few miles from the river. This was also the period of selective cutting, and only the best of the trees were logged. By the 1840s, the best white pine in the Northeast had been exhausted. Lumbermen set their eyes on the forests of the Great Lakes. Pennsylvania, which had replaced Maine as the leading lumber producer, would continue to reign through the 1860s, but the Great Lake forests were found to be much more plentiful than those of the East. Generations will cease to live before this will cease to be a branch of commerce, a vast resource. Freeman Hunt, Merchants Magazine and Commercial Review, 1848. Michigan would take over from Pennsylvania as the leading lumber producer and continue to do so until nearly the end of the 19th century. At the time, it was believed that the pine was an inexhaustible resource here in Michigan. Based on the rate of logging in the east, where it took almost 250 years to exhaust the supply of white pine, with the amount that was surveyed here in Michigan, they thought that these pines would last forever. However, history would prove them wrong, along with technology and the great demand for lumber. The eastern white pine would become to be known by another name in Michigan, green gold, because of the great value of this tree. According to Chicago lumberman and editor George W. Hotchkiss in his 1898 book, History of the Lumber and Forestry Industry of the Northwest, the value of the California gold industry up to 1897 had produced $1,340,000,000. Meanwhile, in Michigan alone, the lumber industry had made at the same time $2,649,175,000. This was twice the value of California's gold. For the men and the few women employed in the lumber industry, it was a lucrative industry as well. Hotchkiss noted the amount of wages paid for labor as a total of $1,291,800,000. He broke this down into three categories. Cutting and hauling, this was the work that was done at the logging camps. That was $484,420,000. For driving and booming, the moving of the logs, made $160,475,000 in wages. And sawing and shipping, sawmill work and transporting the finished product, was $645,900,000 in wages. Throughout my career interpreting Michigan's forest history, I've always said that lumber was to Michigan in the 19th century, as the automobile was to the state in the 20th century. It was our most important industry that we've been known for. But like elsewhere, the white pine would not last in Michigan. When logging began in Michigan in the 1840s, most of our lumber was used for local construction and also sent east through to Buffalo and through the Erie Canal to places like Albany and New York City and along the East Coast to help grow the already established eastern United States. But at the same time, Chicago began to grow as a major city on Lake Michigan. And from Chicago, it also became a way to transport lumber further west. With the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s, the Great Plains began to be settled, and this opened up a much larger market for Michigan and Great Lakes white pine. To meet this greater demand, lumber started to be cut year-round using railroads now as the way to move the lumber when rivers were too shallow, too slow to move the logs effectively. And railroads could also get out anywhere that was needed. But railroads were expensive. So to meet the cost of the railroads, logging started to cut not just the largest white pine, but all sizes. Sizes as small as 1 foot diameter, maybe even less. And not just the pine. They cut cedar trees, they cut hemlock trees, they cut maple, oak, elm, ash, trees, hardwood species that would not have floated on the river. So with all of this, our forests really started to decline, and it wasn't an inexhaustive resource as they once believed. Our forests started to run out, and by the 1910s, our industry was effectively finished. The white pine lumber industry crept on until the early 1910s, but it was the end of an era. Some places still continued to cut for brief periods to clear stands that remained valuable. The Salling Hanson and Company of Grayling was one of the larger lumber companies during the 1890s, but was stalled by the Panic of 1893, an economic depression that rocked the country until about 1896. When the SHCO resumed operations in 1896, they had an 86-acre stand of pine remaining from a prior cut, and also a newly purchased 8,000-acre stand of pine nearby. Because the company, like most in the industry, was now using the more expensive railroad to move the logs to the sawmills, they left the large 150-foot-plus pine trees in the smaller stand to cut later when the economics of doing so. By the time the company dissolved in the 1910s, this stand had still not been cut. And in 1927, Rasmus Hansen, sole surviving partner of the Salling Hansen Company, would sell the land to Karen Hartwick, the daughter of one of his partners, Nels Mickelson. Karen Hartwick would then donate the land to the state of Michigan to create Hartwick Pines State Park. On the other hand, when lumberman David Ward died in 1900, his will stipulated that his remaining timber holdings were to be liquidated within 12 years. This included more than 80,000 acres of prime timberland in Antrim, Charlevoix, Crawford, Kalkaska, and Otsego counties in the northern Lower Peninsula. The lumber town of DeWard was built on the Manistee River in Crawford County as a site of the sawmill and railroad transportation of the lumber. The new sawmill went into operation in early 1901 and shut down operations in 1912. When the mill closed, the families moved out, the mill equipment was sold, and the forests surrounding DeWard had all been cleared. DeWard was the last of Michigan's lumber boom towns. The only memory of this is the decaying foundations of the town site and the numerous stumps. With the white pine boom over in Michigan, many of the lumbermen and loggers moved on to new areas to cut. This included Wisconsin and Minnesota, in the Great Lakes region, where the cut would continue of the white pine for about a decade or more. Others went west to the forests of the Pacific Northwest, while some headed to the south. Those that remained in Michigan tried their hand at farming or headed to the cities to work in new industries, such as the growing automotive industry. Reforestation. During the new period of reforestation that had begun, it was found that the white pine was a difficult tree to regrow in the cut-over land. It was more susceptible to extreme temperatures than the hardier red pine and was often attacked by the pest, the white pine weevil, and white pine blister rust, a fungus that kills the trees. When the Civilian Conservation Corps was created in the 1930s and took over much of the reforestation effort, the eradication of both the white pine weevil and blister rust was part of their work. However, it was much easier for them to plant red pines than white pines. Michigan forests came back during the 20th century, but there has only been mixed success with the growth of the white pine. Natural regeneration of the white pine is happening where some of the surviving pines remain, such as at Hartwick Pines State Park, but it is safe to say that no one will ever again see the great white pine forest that once stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Plains. To just wrap up here, the white pine, as you've heard, very important tree here in Michigan, the Great Lakes region, and along through the Northeast and a good portion of the eastern United States. It's the state tree for both Maine and here in Michigan, just to show an example of its importance, that it's one of the symbols of two of the great lumber states. The eastern white pine is the tree that made the forest here in the Great Lakes region and the importance of it in forest history. It was the forest habitat of wildlife that gave rise to the importance of the fur trade in North America. And it was the white pine forest that was home to many of these great fur-bearing animals. It was a sacred tree to many of the North American indigenous peoples, particularly those of the eastern United States and Canada, what we would call the Iroquois and the Algonquian people. It was very sacred in many of their beliefs. And of course, then, for the lumber industry, as we touched on here today, and we will continue to touch on through the next several episodes of the lumber industry here in Michigan, and then along with the importance of reforestation in Michigan. And future episodes will also have specifically about Hartwick Pines State Park. I touched on that today with the Salling Hansen Company, and along with David Ward and the town of DeWard, the last lumber boomtown in Michigan. And then in a following season, we'll be hitting on the Civilian Conservation Corps quite a bit. And I'll go back to the east to do some episodes on kind of the origins of the lumber industry in the East in places like Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania. Thank you for listening here to North Country History with Rob Berg. If you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend. It's the easiest and best way to expand the listenership of the podcast that ensures that I'll be able to stay on the air. Like the episode, like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast. If you want to take it on the go when you're not within Wi-Fi or cell data, download the episodes so you can listen wherever you can. To do so, if you're looking for the podcast, check out Buzzsprout and anywhere that you find podcasts. Get your podcasts at, and you can follow along on YouTube and at Facebook, Rob Berg, Environmental Historian. Thanks a lot, and I hope you listen again. Have a great day. Bye now. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.